Good morning, everyone. My name is Lorna, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm always so surprised, actually, when people respond so readily with that, hi, Lorna. I always expect them to say, no, you're not. I remember the very first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous I went to, and this fellow got up and he said, my name's Joe and I'm an alcoholic. And I remember thinking to myself, well, we don't all want to know. Keep some things to yourself, But I was mesmerized by it. But before I kick off, when I first used to speak, I used to think and say that I hope I can say something here today that's going to be of help to you. I hope I can help someone in this room. And, of course, now I know that I'm not here to help anyone, and I'm totally unable to do that. And God has given me this opportunity to speak, and I want to thank the committee for selecting me. And I'm here to get help and to have myself reflected in you. So thank you so much for this chance. And I always am sort of amazed when I'm asked to speak in California. I think, I've entered the land of the great speakers. And how come I've been selected? And I think that I always think that they've asked me for Sunday morning and they somehow think that's a spiritual speaker. And I've been so grumpy this weekend, and I think that the committee will probably get together afterwards and say, who invited her? And they'll all shrug their shoulders. It wasn't me. I don't know. Where did she come from? So, when I first used to qualify, I used to think at the end of my talk, the next time I speak, I must get my story straight. And there's no getting it straight. I see it differently all the time. I'm constantly seeing, my present alters my past. And for instance, before I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, I had a very lovely childhood. And Alcoholics Anonymous sort of ruined my childhood. As I got more sober, I saw... it ended up with my parents were totally demonic, and I was lucky to have survived it at all. And, it was just terrible. And now I think I had a very blessed childhood. And I'm very lucky that I had the parents I had, and I'm very blessed with the childhood that I had. And, before I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, I thought that I was totally unworthy. And coming into Alcoholics Anonymous and spending some years here, I found out, and you let me know, that I was worthy, and I did have worth. And now I know that I'm totally unworthy, and I have no worth. And I really feel that, if I cast the searchlight over my life, I cannot in any way find anything, not one thing, that warrants the magnitude of the gift I've been given. And I've done nothing whatsoever to deserve this. My sponsor used to say to me, there were two things she never wanted to hear out of my mouth. One of them was, it's hard for me. It's hard for me to make phone calls. It's hard for me to go to meetings. It's hard for me to end the sentence. She said, honey, it's hard for us all. And, Alcoholics Anonymous is not for the faint-hearted. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want it if it was easy. I mean, I like the fact that it's a little difficult. And the other thing she didn't want to hear out of my mouth were the words, I deserve. I deserve a nice relationship. I deserve to be happy. I deserve a good job. She said, honey, if you got what you deserve. You can be grateful that you have a God of mercy and not a God of justice. And in light of that, I'm always amazed, actually, that when I hear people in Alcoholics Anonymous on a private level being for the death penalty, I just think it's amazing that anyone of us can be for capital punishment, because it's a very fine line between me standing here and death row. It can be just another drink. So, anyway, I guess you sort of like to hear my story. First of all, I want to say Happy Easter and Happy Passover for all of us. And it's a very, very wonderful and special day to be able to speak. I guess the traditional thing is to kick off with my drinking story, and you'll hear when I qualify that I'm really all over the place because I have no idea what I'm going to say when I get up here, and I ask God to speak through me, but sometimes he's busy in China and leaves me alone, and he's popped off somewhere and I don't know what to say. Anyway, I'll talk about my last drink. I didn't actually have a last drink. I had a last sip of alcohol. I had been married, actually. My husband had finally left, and I thought it was the most interesting thing he'd ever done. And I was desperate to get this poor wretch back, I think, so I could torture him some more. And I went to a few meetings of Al-Anon, and then I went to some open AA meetings, because they said in Al-Anon you should go to open AA meetings. And I went into these open AA meetings, and I was fascinated with these stories, absolutely fascinated. And I really think that that's the thing that qualifies an alcoholic. I think if you want to sit and listen to stories about people throwing up on each other and crawling on the bathroom floor and having blackouts, there's something sort of wrong with you. And anyway, I went to these open AA meetings, but one day it wasn't the worst of my drinking at all. It was just one of those god-awful days. And I'm always amazed, when in meetings when we hear someone speak, say we hear a man speak and he'll say, I was in this terrible car accident and they had to remove half my stomach, and I had the last rites read to me, and I had God knows how many blood transfusions, and I was in a coma for 6 days. And then you're sitting there going, oh my God. And then he says, but that wasn't to be the end of my drinking. I was to drink for another 10 years. And then he'll say, I walked out of the house one morning and the neighbor looked at me cross-eyed, and that was it. Or I missed my child's school play or something. And so the last of my drinking wasn't particularly dramatic at all. You can see I'm all over the place. I was like a plane coming into land without its landing gear, and I belly flopped along the runway for a long time. And I finally ended up in this sort of clump of trees, and my wings were torn off, and there were passengers and luggage all over the place, and I was just a mess. It wasn't anything, splendid. So I had the end of my drinking. I'd been going out with this, after this marriage, I'd been going out with this fellow, and I wanted to marry this chap. The fact that he hadn't asked me or posed no problem to me. I wanted to marry him because he had the one thing in the world I wanted. And it wasn't great love of me, it wasn't noble feelings, it wasn't, gentlemanly behavior or anything like that. He had a maid. And I wanted the maid. I wanted someone to brush my hair, to lay my clothes out in the morning, to run the bath, to tell me that's what I was eating. I was too busy, you understand. I was very, very busy. And so I was willing to allow this fellow, to touch the sacred temple in order to get to the maid. And in some circles, that's called prostitution. Anyway, I woke up one Sunday morning in August, and I'd had a girlfriend staying with me for the weekend. I couldn't wait to get rid of her, and finally she left, and I went downstairs. I live in New York, and I went downstairs to the bodega. This isn't a New York accent, actually. It's a West Texas accent. I went down to the local bodega, and I got myself a carton of Tropicana, and I came back upstairs, and I made myself a jug of vodka and orange juice. And I took a whole tumbler full of this stuff, and as it went down and it hit my stomach, all the feelings came up and hit my soul. My soul went, oh, we can keep them at bay just one more day. We can keep this going one more day. And I had a date with the lover for brunch. And I got into the shower, and I could not put the glass down. And I was weaving around in the shower, trying to soak myself up, keeping the liquid out of the shower. And I think God looked out from heaven that day and went, oy vey, this one, I have a Jewish God. Anyway, and God took mercy on me, and I found myself in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous that afternoon, and because I had absolutely nowhere to go. I mean, I'm always amazed when people say, I came into Alcoholics, or I didn't come into Alcoholics Anonymous to be miserable, or I didn't come in, as though they woke up one morning and said, well, I think I'll nip along to AA. I mean, I didn't come into Alcoholics Anonymous. I was totally brought into here. I was absolutely led in here. Anyway, I went to this meeting of AA, and this woman spoke, and she told my story up to where I was at that moment. And then she went on. For another 15 years, she went on. And I was horrified. And I ran out onto Lexington Avenue, and I ran into the local bar, and I threw back another vodka and orange juice. And to cut a very long story short, the following day, I went into Alcoholics Anonymous, and I said, I'm here for myself. And 9 days later, I was on a business trip to Washington. And after the business, I was at these people's home, and they had a dinner. And there were about 5 of us, I think, for dinner. And a tumbler full of wine was poured at each one's table. And at each one's setting, rather. And I didn't know enough to say, no thank you. I didn't know enough to say, I'm not drinking, or could you please remove that. I thought the whole purpose of Alcoholics Anonymous was to learn how to resist alcohol. I thought I was in here to develop tools so that I could sit with alcohol and say, no, it doesn't bother me. Please, you go right ahead, you drink. I thought I was to somehow be hip and cool around alcohol. I didn't understand the wonder and the spiritual power of surrender. I didn't get it. So I resisted it through the salad. And I resisted it through main course. And I resisted it through dessert. And then they started having coffee and dessert, or coffee and cheese. And then this goblet of wine started talking to me. And it said to me, oh, Lorna, you're always so bloody dramatic. What are you doing in AA for your simple problem? You need to lose 10 pounds. That's your problem, Why don't you exercise? You've never read the classics. Have you ever picked up Faulkner? No? And it said to me, I'm not your problem. I am on your side. Don't you always feel better when we're together? Don't you always feel prettier and you're able to speak better? I'm not against you. I'm with you. And as it spoke to me, it sort of changed from alcohol into this sort of deep sacramental liquid. And the booze said to me, now look at the other people at this table. Are they weeping and telling up their strangers intimate details of their lives? No. Are they, flopping about on the dinner table? No. Why can't you be like them? And I said, you're absolutely right. I really have overreacted. And I picked up this goblet and I took a sip. And that sip, whereas 10 days before, the whole carafe of vodka and orange juice, the whole day of drinking had eased my soul, but hadn't satisfied me. This one sip of alcohol hit my soul, and my soul went into absolute terror. And it was as though there were these, I often describe it, there were these enormous doors that were sort of like 80 tons and 14 feet thick and, yards high, that were released from their moorings, and they came shuntering across the film of my life. And they were going to close with this sort of huge thud. And I was going to be on one side, and you were going to be on the other. And no matter how much I pounded on those doors, you were not going to be able to hear me. And I came back on Amtrak the following day to New York, and I wept all the way back. And I begged God, I said, please, please let me back in. I didn't know about drinking. I didn't understand what sobriety was. I didn't have any of that highfalutin stuff. I didn't get it at all. I didn't even know that I really drank. I couldn't really see my drinking. I just knew I wanted to be with you. And I said to God, I can't do this thing a day at a time. Obviously, in the day, I drank. So I don't understand this day at a time. I need a covenant forever. And I will do anything for you. I will go to any lengths for you. And I think God thought, oh yeah? All right. So I came back and I went up to a meeting called Lenox Hill. And it had a reputation for being sort of the silk stocking meeting of New York. And I went in there and I sat in the front row. And this fellow came up to me and he said, you can't sit there. He said, Harriet and Henry, whatever their names were, he said, have been coming to Lenox Hill for 20 years, and they always sit there, and you can't sit there. And I don't really remember much about this fellow, but he was the sort, he had trousers with little spuming whales embroidered in his trousers, and, another creature across his thing here. And I said, well, I don't know who sits here, but I'm here now and I'm not leaving. And so that was 21 years ago, and I haven't left, but I have sat in different seats. And I do want to push that. I know that, if you have a home group and there's a seat there, and they say, well, that's Joe's seat, or that's Mary's seat, or Hillary always sits there, change it. Don't sit in the same seat, for God's sakes. If you've got the same big book that you had when you came in, for God's sakes, buy a new one, don't carry this thing like some talisman around, like, well, this is my big book and this is the original one I've been given. For God's sakes, give it away. And I think that the whole essence is change, 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 change. And I notice a lot of people didn't say a thing. They just like, that's my big book and I've had it, my sponsor gave it to me. But anything I've said, you know, you've taught me so much, and anything I've said, well, I always do it this way, or this is the way I always do something, or this is, every time I use those kind of words, or that's the way I am. Those are sort of loser phrases, you know. I've made my life about this big. About this big. I have no idea who I am or what is in store for me. I've never been in this day sober before. Anyway, I came into AA and I actually didn't know how you knew I was new. I walked in the doors and I thought that you took one look at me and you thought to yourselves, well, thank God Lorna has arrived. Now, because Lorna adds great tone and class to Alcoholics Anonymous. And finally we can hold our heads up high. And we don't have to be quite so anonymous because she is among us. And in reality, what was happening was you were patting me on the shoulders, you know how you do, and you said, you keep coming back, you're in the right place. And I didn't know what it was about me that you could tell that I was new, and maybe it was the fact that I've been wearing the same dress for the past 3 months, and I came in festooned in jewelry. I had jewelry all over the place, and I had gobs of makeup on. And I didn't take it off at night. I was sort of like, I was like Elizabeth I. I just put more on every day. And I wondered how you knew I was new. I am so glad, you know, I often say, I'm so glad that I came into Alcoholics Anonymous before the craze of piercing and tattooing became popular. Because I probably would have had the Last Supper put on my chest or something, you know. And I probably would have had a dish put in my lower lip or something. But I wore black. You know, people tell me that I have fairly large eyes, but I guess spiritually I felt I was disappearing. And I wore an inch of kohl, you know, like Egyptian wear and Indian women wear kohl around my eyes, because I thought you needed to see them. I mean, I looked like a raccoon, but of course I thought I was the cat's pajamas. And but also with this feeling like I added great tone and class, I also felt, oh my God, I hope they don't kick me out. I hope they don't ask me how much I've drunk. I had this awful fear that someone was going to come up to me and he was going to be probably the sort that would have, you know, praying hand cufflinks or something like that. And he'd say to me, you know, exactly how much have you drunk? And I'd say, well, I don't know, not very much, really. And he'd say, look, sister, you know, we're a busy organization in here, and we really don't have time for you. And we notice you eat an awful lot of cookies, and do you mind? So I was quite a piece of work coming in here. And it took me about 2 years to really grasp my drinking story. I couldn't see my drinking. You know, I felt at the beginning, I thought, well, aren't I clever that I've come into Alcoholics Anonymous? When I did. Because I have nipped this thing in the bud. I am the sort that if I don't watch it, I could really develop a drinking problem. And I felt like I had sort of been lightly dusted with alcoholism, you know. I had been dipped in alcoholism, but I didn't have a really severe case of it. And as I stayed sober, my story was revealed to me. And I saw, well, maybe that was called passing out at the dinner table. You know, maybe that wasn't, maybe, you know, and I was able to see my drinking and my drugging. And I had a sponsor who was absolutely wonderful for me. She never talked to me about my drinking and never insisted that I get in touch with my drinking story, because I couldn't. I could not see it. It was so well hidden from me. It was sort of like wearing surgical gloves. It fit me perfectly. And she would say things to me like, Lorna, if you stay with us, you can develop a life that will be like having a quiver of golden arrows on your back. And when you come into a situation in life that you're not too sure how to handle, you'll be able to reach back, select the perfect arrow, put it in your bow, and hit bullseye every time. And the idea of hitting bullseye was so intoxicating to me. I never hit bullseye. I was always inappropriate. Always. I went into mini skirts the year Max's came out, and I was always laughing inappropriately. I was always wrong. And you know, we say, alcoholics, we're always whining and we're always saying, well, I never felt like I fit in. I never felt like... And you know what? We don't fit in. We're not kind of regular folk. And this thing about fitting in, I'm not like other people. And I think a lot of pain comes to us in sobriety when we try to be like other people. And I'm just not. I've been touched. I've been raised from the dead. You know, I went to Mass this morning, and there's the whole celebration of Easter, of Christ rising from the dead. And it's this whole enormous celebration worldwide. And masses of art has been dedicated to this thing. It's moved armies and people, and wonderful things have been done in his name, and hideous things have been done in his name. And you know, every single one of us has had that experience. Every single one of us in this room. And I'm like, and people will say to me, you know, but you've been raised in the... I'm like, yeah, but I want to talk to you about my career, you know. And I kind of push that aside, and I sort of don't always grasp the magnitude of exactly what has happened to me. And you can see I have a lot of senior moments when I talk, and it's God sending messages from China. Anyway, I guess I should talk about sobriety and coming in to the program. And when I have so many different views on it. You know, one time I used to think that one should work the program, and now I don't believe that. If you had asked me at one time, what is the most important thing in your life? I would have shot back to you immediately, the most important thing in my life is my sobriety. Well, it's no longer true. And I don't know what happened to me. Somewhere around 14, 15 years, maybe, I was a very late bloomer. I realized that the most important thing in my life was not my sobriety. Because, you know, I don't always love sobriety. I'm not always crazy about it. I don't want to always see it in living color. But I'm crazy about Alcoholics Anonymous. And if you were to ask me today what's the most important thing in your life, I would have to say the most important thing in my life is Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm in love with Alcoholics Anonymous. And on that... And on that vein, you know, we have no opinion on outside issues, but I have a lot. And in that vein, this program, which is so phenomenal and been so wonderful to so many millions of us, asks one thing of me. One thing it asks, and one thing only. It asks that I not break my anonymity at the level of press, radio, and film. And there's been a television program out recently about alcoholism, and they broke their anonymity. And I just find it just so upsetting. And, for no matter what noble reason I say I'm doing it, whether I think it's going to help 3 million people, it doesn't matter. Alcoholics Anonymous asks me not to do it. So, that's my little statement. So coming into the program, I had this fabulous sponsor, and one of the things she said to me was, get the alcohol out of your house. And I was like, good God, she's really overreacting. And I said to her, now listen, Ellen, I said, if I suddenly found out I was allergic to diamonds, would you tell me to throw those out? And she said, well, listen to you, qualifying alcohol with diamonds, get it out of your house. And I'm very glad that I did. And, very often alcoholics will say, well, just because I've stopped drinking doesn't mean to say I want to impose that on my friends. And when my friends come over, I want to be able to offer them a drink. I want to be social. People that don't smoke don't keep cartons of cigarettes in their house for people that don't. And Orthodox Jews don't keep ham and Swiss cheese in the fridge. And Muslims don't have a side of pork in the freezer. And, I've yet to go to someone's house and they have syringes and heroin and cocaine on the coffee table, and they say, well, we don't shoot up, but maybe you'd like to. When I was 9 years sober, and, I've done these steps in all sorts of fashions, all sorts of ways, and I think the steps are really good. I'm always so amazed, actually, when we have the third step and we go, and it's this very soft step, and I was talking to Steve about this the other night, about, it's so easy and gentle. We say we're going to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. And then the very next breath, we get this, military stance. We're going to take a fearless moral inventory of ourselves. We take it back again. And I don't believe it anymore. And it's not my experience. And when I was 9 years sober, I had done a lot of ninth step work. And then when I was 9 years sober, suddenly ninth step work plummeted me onto a totally different level. And I knew I wanted to make amends to my mother. And like a lot of alcoholic women, I'd had a very difficult relationship with my mother. And I didn't know, how does one make amends to one's mother? I came to America when I was 18 from England, and I had very rarely gone home after that. And I decided to go. I'd used my mother's house as a stopping off place. I'd done a lot of traveling. I'd been back and forth to India a lot, and I would use it as a place to change my clothes. And I decided to go home and spend some time with my mother, just to be with her. And I made no other plans. I didn't arrange to go to the continent or to stay with friends overnight. I thought I'd just stay with her. And I spent 3 weeks with her, and talking and chatting, and I made a decision that instead of focusing on what she hadn't gotten right for me in my childhood, I would focus on all the things that were right. And I remembered all the wonderful little things she had taught me. And it was difficult because I had buried all those things under so much annoyance about what she'd gotten wrong. And I got out the family album and I went over the photographs with my mother, and I asked my mother about her childhood and about her mother and about how she met my father and about her cousins and where she went to school, and I asked her about her life. And when my parents were married a few years, they lost their first girl, a daughter. Her name was Pamela, and she died of meningitis. And when I was at home in England this time, I decided to go and find this grave of my sister. And my mother was very reluctant for me to do this. She said, "Oh, I don't know where it is. It's on the other side of London somewhere." She said she hadn't been there since my sister's funeral, which at that time was 45 years beforehand. And I determined, though, to find it. And I made this pilgrimage, and I went to the other side of London, and it was very difficult. And I went into this cemetery, and it was totally overgrown. And there were a couple of grave diggers there. They were refurbishing the graves. They were turning over the soil. And one of them took me into an office, and they pulled down these huge dusty ledgers, sort of this Dickensian thing. And they looked up my sister's dates. And they found her dates, and they found the plot where she was buried. And the grave digger walked with me through this jungle with his machete, and he hacked away brambles and ivy and God knows what. And anyway, after about half an hour, we found this grave, and it was this big marble slab. And on it, I didn't know that it had been a family grave. There were sort of grandparents and granduncles and things that I had heard about, but I had no idea where they were. And at the very bottom on this stone were written the words, "God took our darling daughter to dwell with him above." And I stood at that side of that grave, and I wept. And I, for the first time in my selfish, self-centered, me life, I realized, that my parents' path on this world had not been just to produce me, that they had had their own joys and sorrows and pleasures and pains and disappointments long before I came on the scene. And I was able to identify with my young parents standing in exactly that same spot that I was at that time, probably weeping and so confused about the death of their darling daughter. And I identified with my parents. And I went home, and my mother asked me, she said, "Did you find the grave?" And I said, "Yes, Mother, I did." And she said to me, "Did you cry?" And I said, "Yes, Mother, I cried." And my mother just sobbed. 45 years of pain just blew out of her. And I was able to hold my mother and to do something I hadn't done in years. I held her, and I let her skin touch my skin, and I let her hair touch my face, and I looked into those blue, blue eyes, and I knew I loved my mother. And I don't very often cry up here, really. And when I left England that time, in typical alcoholic fashion, I had this great amend with my mother, and I remember thinking to myself, it was all a fluke. It didn't really happen. It wasn't real. And, if only she would die now, and then I could always say that I had a good relationship with my mother, That, because I knew I couldn't keep it up, I couldn't keep this healed relationship up with my mother. But my mother didn't die, and I was to see her many times after that. And each time the relationship was good, and I was all right with her. And my mother died of chronic alcoholism, and I was all right with her. And I'm very, very grateful for that. When I was 15 years sober, I was plummeted into the worst pain I've ever known in my life. Actually, my mother died when I was 11 years sober, and I remember meeting this old Italian priest once in Jerusalem, and he said that the death of the father is important, but it's the death of the mother that really, alters us psychically. And we don't grow emotionally or come into our own spiritually until the mother dies. That was his belief, and it certainly was true for me. So, when my mother died, I was 11 years sober, and when I was 15 years sober, the avalanche came down on me. And it was, this is really distracting. Anyway, let me just think where I'm at. Thank you. It was brought about by a loss, and I think nearly always it's a loss of some kind or the other. And for me, what else does an alcoholic? I mean, for me, it was the end of a relationship. But very often it can be, the loss of a job. It can be, I don't know what the loss can be. And we can't be judged on what that is, what that loss might be. But I hit subterranean fields of pain, all the pain that I think I'd never allowed myself to experience over countless lifetimes, and all the pain that I'd ever dished out to others, I got to feel. And it was dreadful. I've never felt more suicidal in all my life. I was 15 years sober. The big book flew out the window. I mean, my sponsees became my sponsors. All the sayings in the meetings became totally trite. And the only thing I was left with was smart feet. And my feet took me to meetings. And I screamed and I cried and I carried on. And it lasted 4 years. And people would say, she's got how long? 17 years? Well, I certainly don't want what she's got. And I was very, very friendly with Mother Teresa, and I've been in India many times and worked with the Missionaries of Charity and done all that. And I desperately wanted a mother, and I went to India to see Mother, and she put me up in the orphanage, and I was in such a state. I was sort of envying the lepers. I just thought they're better off than I am. And anyway, Mother was in New York that summer. She came to New York and she asked me, she said, "How are you? How is it going for you?" And I said, "Mother, it's hell. It's absolute hell." And she looked at me and she said, "How God must love you." She said, "And He wants to be very intimate with you. But He is a jealous lover, and He is burning out of your soul everything unlike Himself." And I said, "Well, gee, that's swell, Mother." But, I wish His kisses would be a little less passionate here. People often say to me, "How did you get out of that pain?" And the truth is, I didn't get out of it. The truth is that I think God came into the desert and brought me out. I can't tell you that I did anything. And I think, there might come a time, there might be someone in this room, there comes a time when you have a little while of sobriety and nothing works. And that's when the danger is. And people are saying to you, "Well, you should do a 4th step on that." Or, "Why don't you pray some more?" Or, "Working with newcomers is always the antidote." No, it's not. It's not. And there are times, if I always had the antidote, if I always knew, then this would not be of the Spirit, this program. Because I would know the answers. Oh, well, you're in that kind of pain? Do a 4th step. You're in this kind of pain? Get a newcomer. It doesn't always work that way. And I had incredible spiritual pride. I thought I knew what to do. I knew how to meditate and to pray and to do all that stuff. And I was wiped out. Nothing I applied could I do. And I had one friend at this time, and it was wonderful because I would call her in the mornings, and she never said to me, you know, Lorna, you should pray, or why don't you do this, or why don't you do that. All she said to me was, Lorna, you're doing so well. Just remember to breathe. And I think, you know, for some of us, when you hit over that 10-year mark, I mean, I don't mean to be generalization, but very often it happens that way. And we think, our program's dreadful because here I am in this kind of pain and I must have done something wrong. Doesn't the 10th step say, you know, if you're in pain, there must be something wrong with you? Oh, I mean, really. I mean, that is so trite. Tell some child in Northern Ireland that's seen his father blown to bits, or some young Vietnamese girl that's been raped, you know, that if you're in trouble or if you're upset, there's something wrong with you. It's not necessarily so. And, you know, just because I feel uncomfortable doesn't mean to say I'm doing something wrong. It's very often an indication that I'm doing something very, very right. I often think, you know, of Jesus when he was in the garden. I said to them in New York, you know, you can mention Jesus in an AA room and clear the room. But anyway, I often think, you know, of him in the Garden of Gethsemane, the agony in the garden, and they say, you know, he's in so much pain he was sweating blood. And I could sort of imagine, you know, that one of the disciples might have gone up to him and said, you know, really, you've been acting very strange lately. You know, we're in the big city, we're just from Galilee, and you come into the city and you have to ride on a donkey. I mean, that really embarrassed us no end. And then you're in the temple and you're flinging your weight around and throwing them all out of the temple. And then we have this Passover meal, and then you have to tell us that the bread and the wine is your body and blood. I mean, you know, it almost made us throw up. It was so disgusting. And now you're talking about death and doom and gloom. You know, Jesus, I think you're clinically depressed. You should take some Prozac. When that kind of thing happens to us, when we feel, you know, we say we want to be in a spiritual program, but then I said, when I first found out about Jesus, that's what I wanted. I wanted to be a Messiah. You know, I thought, well, I'd be very good at some Messiah. And then I had when I was 15 years sober, and I was like, no, I don't want to be a Messiah, I want to be a masseuse. That's what I want to be, you know. But when those pains happen to us in sobriety, when we get our Garden of Gethsemane, when we get our pain, we think there's something wrong with us. We think we've done something wrong. And it's not necessarily so. And I just want to say to you, any of you, you know, that have any time, don't discourage. But very often we have those dark nights, and we're just meant to hold on tight and go through it. And I often tell this story. When I was, I don't know how long I was there, but it was around this time, I happened to be in the Sinai desert, that is. And I wanted to go somewhere, and I got this Bedouin to take me on a camel. And anyway, we're out in the Sinai, and he gets off the camel, and in Arabic and broken English, he hands me the camel, and he hands me the reins, and he says, "The camel knows the way." And he walks off, and I turn around, and I'm screaming at him, you know, where the hell are you going? You can't leave me here. And he just ignored me, and he walked over a sand dune. Now, as far as I know, there might have been a 6-lane highway on the other side of this thing. I don't know. But, I mean, there I was, abandoned in the Sinai on a camel. And a camel's not the sort of thing you're going to leap off and on and that. I mean, you're trapped. And I was terrified. And I want to tell you, you have no idea what the third step is until you've been on a camel in the Sinai. And this camel didn't, you know, most camels had sort of romantic Middle Eastern names like Rashid or Mohammed or Akram or something like that. And mine was called Bob Marley. And I didn't know how a camel with the name of a Jamaican reggae singer was going to find out how to get in. But anyway, I went through this terror, and then I went through surrender. You know, what could I do? I had to trust that he had told me the camel knows the way. And then it turned into spiritual grandiosity. I thought, well, of course I'm in the Sinai by myself. Isn't this where God brings all his chosen ones to speak to them? You know? And he's going to speak to me. Well, nothing happened, and the only message I got was I should have covered myself a bit more, and 2 hours later Bob Marley delivered me to my destination. But it was around this time too that I came out of this awful pain that I was in. And there are so many, for those of you that are, worried about where you might be in sobriety, or worried about your spiritual life, or thinking that you don't do enough, and I don't know. I just don't know what spirituality is. I think it's sort of being kind. I love what the Dalai Lama says, and he says, kindness is my religion. And I have a long way to go in that area. I sometimes am, sometimes not, and I don't know, but I don't think spirituality is what I think it is. I think God is more human than I am. And I'm telling this, I have never told this story so that it's on tape, but I'm going to tell this story to you. It's not a very nice story, and you'll probably run screaming from the room and thinking, how awful she is. But anyway, one time I was in New York, and I was at a luncheon, and at the luncheon they had given us a promotion, an umbrella, and a long umbrella. And after the luncheon, I was standing with a girlfriend of mine on 43rd Street and Madison Avenue. We were chatting before we parted to go back to our various places to work. And I'm all done up in my business suit and everything, and this little old lady comes by, and she has a pink fluffy coat on, and she's on a cane. And as she comes by, she gets her cane and she wraps my ankles. And she says, "Move out the way." And I turned around, and I picked up this umbrella, and I brought it down, whack, across her back. And I said, "You miserable little thing," and the whole street, I screamed out, and the whole street was like freeze-framed. And they turned around, and people were looking, and she was looking at me startled, and no one could quite sort of fit the picture. And while they were all like that, it had felt so delicious, I lifted the umbrella and I gave her another one. And I was 7 years sober at the time. So you can see why they asked me to speak, because I need a lot of help. Anyway, it's getting towards the time of closing, and there's a couple of stories I always like to close with. And when Jesus was on his cross, there were crucified with him at the same time 2 other fellows. And one of them turned to Jesus, and he said to him, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus did not turn to him and say, "Look, buddy, can't you see I'm in the middle of a big spiritual experience here? Do you know? I mean, I might look like I'm in a sorry state, but I'm just going to go through this, and then I'm going to die, and then I'm going to be raised from the dead, and then I'm going to be sitting at the right hand of the Father. I hope you make it." Didn't say that at all. And Alcoholics Anonymous, we're always, I think very often in here, and I certainly have been guilty of it, that we talk about, we're so terrified of intimacy. We say, we have an issue with intimacy, we're scared of intimacy. And really, I think we're the most intimate people I know. I remember once taking a sponsee of mine to the airport. She was returning to Australia. And I sponsored her for quite a while. I knew every intimate detail about her life. And on the way to the airport, I said to her, "Robin, what's your last name?" And we are intimate with each other on such a different level. And when I walked in the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, you didn't say to me, "You look a right mess. We're on the 11th step tonight. I hope you make it, sister." You intimately included me in your life in that moment. You intimately took me in. You didn't hold back. You didn't say, "Well, when you've got 30 days, we'll give you the program. Or when you've got 4 years, then we'll tell you this. Or we'll reveal it to you at some time." The instant I walked through the door, it was given, freely given. You said, "These are the steps we took. And here's a cup of coffee, here's a seat for you." And I was included. You said to me, "This day you can be with us in paradise." And very often, it's said, and paradise, very often you hear speakers are up here saying that it is beyond their wildest dreams. For me, it has not been beyond my wildest dreams. I could have thought of something far wilder than this. What they don't tell you, newcomers, is some of those dreams are nightmares. But just now, I can tell you it is beyond my wildest dreams. I've just written a book, and it's all about me, so it's fascinating. And I've self-published, and it's being printed as I speak, and I didn't realize it's taken me 10 years to do this, I didn't realize until I'd written it that it's been beyond my wild. I didn't understand that I had a book in me, and it's been such a phenomenal process to do this book. And sometimes our wildest dreams, we have to do them before we realize. It's like, sometimes we have to fall in love with the person that we're with rather than waiting for the right person to always come along. And sometimes that person is sitting right next to us or right with us. And so it has been for me. My wildest dreams have come true. And I'm very, very blessed. And I'd like to end with this story. 2,500 years ago, there was a man walking the earth, and his name was Siddhartha. And I want to preamble this with saying that, often I believe that in Alcoholics Anonymous, we are called not to choose the sure thing. It's not always about being safe. I love the saying that ships are safe in the harbour, but ships aren't built for the harbour. And we're not built for the harbour. We're built to go out there and risk and take chances. And not always to seek the comfortable thing or the sure thing. And so this man, Siddhartha, was living on the earth 2,500 years ago, and he was an Indian prince. And he was determined to find out the meaning of life. He wanted to know why man suffers. Why do we suffer? What is this thing called suffering? Why do we suffer? Anyway, he ended up, after many spiritual trials and tribulations, he ended up sitting under a Bodhi tree in an area of Bihar in India called Bodh. And he sat there and he said, "I am going to sit here until I know the meaning of life." And Siddhartha did not choose the sure thing. The sure thing for him was he could have gone back to his father's palaces, he could have gone back to his wife and his children, and he could have had the sure thing. And he didn't. He sat there determined on his quest. And at one point, the the forces of Mara, the devil, came to him and said to him, "Who do you think you are? Who gives you the right to sit there and to know these truths?" And the Buddha, because that's what he was, reached out his hand to the earth, and he asked the earth to give witness to him that through his years of moral living and integrity, he had earned the right to sit under that tree. And he became enlightened. And because of that enlightenment, because that man went that extra step, I, and millions like me, get an opportunity to see something revealed in a different way. And 500 years after the Buddha walked on the earth, there was another man, and his name was Jesus. And Jesus, too, could have chosen the sure thing. When he was in that garden, and he knew it was getting hot politically for him, he could have nipped back to Galilee. He could have gone back. He could have gotten married and had children. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, by the way, getting married and have children. But he could have done that, but he didn't. He just went ahead with what was in front of him and in front of him and in front of him. And it was not the sure thing. It was a great risk. And because Jesus did that, because he didn't choose the sure thing, the comfortable thing, the easy thing, I, and millions like me, have a chance to see another possibility of a life. And 2,000 years after Jesus walked the earth, there was another man, and his name was Bill Wilson. And Bill Wilson was in Akron, Ohio. And he'd been sober. He hadn't had a drink for 6 months. And he was there on business. And the business had gone dreadfully. It had a dreadful, dreadful day. And he was staying in a hotel. And he went down to the lobby. And there down at one end of the lobby was the sure thing. And the sure thing was the bar. And he could hear people laughing and drinking and having a wonderful time. And he knew that that was the sure thing, like I often know that that's the sure thing. You know, I can take a drink and get out of this god-awful day. I'm not worried about the consequences. I'm not thinking about years ahead or anything like that. I want now. And Bill Wilson, in that lobby, turned. He turned, and he walked the other way. He walked away from the sure thing, and he went to that directory, and he started making phone calls. And because, you know, Bill Wilson didn't turn in that lobby thinking, well, by this act, I'm going to allow Lorna K to stand up in San Diego and tell her story, you know, years down the road. He didn't know the consequences of that action, and we can't always know the consequences of our action. I can't always know that if I take this risk, how it's going to ricochet out into the world, what's going to happen, how it might benefit, or whatever. I have no idea what's going to happen. But I'm very grateful to Bill Wilson. I'm very grateful that he took that chance, that he didn't choose the sure thing. And I'm very grateful that you haven't chosen the sure thing. I'm very grateful that you're here this morning. I'm grateful that you go to meetings, that you call your sponsors, that you put money in the baskets, that you read the big book, that you live the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, that you reach out your hand. And I'm very, very grateful for your sobriety. Thank you so much.